The harsh wind whipped across the barren prairie as Faith Jacobson sank to her knees before the small mound of freshly turned earth, her trembling fingers clawing at the dirt while tears carved clean paths down her dust-stained cheeks. She had nothing left to live for, not after losing little Sarah, just 6 months old and the only light in her broken world. The child's fever had raged for 3 days before claiming her tiny life, leaving Faith hollowed out and desperate to join her baby beneath the cold Dakota Territory soil. It was 1876, the summer air thick with heat and the scent of wild sage, when Xavier Lancaster spotted the woman in the dying light. He'd been tracking a small herd of mustangs across the plains when he noticed the lone figure digging frantically at what appeared to be a grave beneath a gnarled cottonwood tree. He pulled his chestnut mare to a halt, watching from a distance as the woman collapsed against the small wooden cross, her body heaving with sobs that carried on the wind. "Whoa, easy now, Maple," Xavier murmured, patting his horse's neck as he dismounted. His spurs jingled softly as his boots hit the ground, and he removed his hat, holding it respectfully at his side as he approached. The woman didn't hear him coming, too consumed by her grief as she scraped at the earth with her bare hands. "Madam," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Madam, you shouldn't be out here alone." Faith jerked her head up, her tear-filled eyes wide with surprise and something akin to fury. "Leave me," she hissed, returning to her desperate digging. "Just leave me be." Xavier took another step closer, noticing the raw, bleeding state of her fingers and the wild determination in her eyes. "I can't do that," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What are you trying to do here?" "What does it look like?" Faith spat, her voice cracking. "I'm going to lie with my baby. There's nothing for me in this world anymore." The realization of what she intended hit Xavier like a physical blow. This woman wasn't just mourning, she was trying to bury herself alive alongside her child. He'd seen grief do terrible things to people during his years on the frontier, but this was something else entirely. "I can't let you do that," he said, moving swiftly now to kneel beside her. "Your baby wouldn't want this. Don't you dare speak of what my Sarah would want." Faith lunged at him, her small fists pounding against his chest. "You didn't know her, you don't know me." "You have no right." Xavier caught her wrists gently but firmly, withstanding her fury as she struggled against his grip. "You're right, I don't know you or your child, but I know life is precious, even when it doesn't feel that way." Faith's strength gave out suddenly, and she collapsed against him, her body racked with sobs. Xavier hesitated only a moment before wrapping his arms around her, holding her trembling form against his chest as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Let me go," she whispered, but there was less conviction in her voice now. "Please, just let me go." "I'm afraid I can't do that," Xavier replied softly, his chin resting atop her head. "Night's coming on fast and there are coyotes and worse out here. Let me take you somewhere safe." "There is no safe place for me anymore," Faith murmured, but she'd stopped fighting him. "Everything I loved is gone." Xavier looked down at the small grave with its crude wooden cross. Someone had carved Sarah into the crossbeam with obvious care. "Was she your only child?" Faith nodded against his chest. "My husband Thomas died from cholera last winter. Sarah was all I had left, and now—" Her voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. As darkness enveloped them completely, Xavier made a decision. He couldn't leave this woman here, not in this state. "There's a small camp I've set up about a mile from here. It's not much, but there's a fire and some hot coffee. Will you come with me just for tonight? In the morning, I can take you wherever you need to go." Faith pulled back slightly, regarding him with red-rimmed eyes. In the moonlight, Xavier could see she was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, with features that might have been beautiful if not contorted by grief. "Why would you help me?" she asked warily. "You don't know me." Xavier offered a gentle smile. "Out here, strangers help strangers. It's how we all survive." He stood, offering his hand. "I'm Xavier Lancaster. Most folks just call me Xav." She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment before finally placing her smaller one within it. "Faith Jacobson," she said, her voice barely audible. "Well, Miss Faith, let's get you somewhere warm for the night." Xavier helped her to her feet, then removed his coat and placed it around her shoulders. She seemed to disappear inside the large garment, making her appear even more fragile. Before leading her to his horse, Xavier paused, watching as Faith turned back toward the small grave. She knelt one last time, placing a gentle kiss on her fingertips before touching them to the cross. "Good night, my sweet angel," she whispered. "Mama loves you." The lump in Xavier's throat made it difficult to swallow as he helped Faith onto Maple, then swung up behind her. She sat stiffly at first, clearly uncomfortable with their proximity. But as they rode, exhaustion won out, and she gradually leaned back against his chest. By the time they reached his small campsite, Faith had fallen into a fitful sleep, her body occasionally jerking with silent sobs. Xavier dismounted carefully, then lifted her down, carrying her to the bedroll beside his small fire. He laid her down gently, adding another log to the flames before settling himself on the opposite side of the fire. He watched the flickering light play across her tear-stained face, wondering what series of tragedies had brought this young woman to such a desperate state. The frontier was unforgiving to everyone, but especially to women. Without family or a husband, survival was nearly impossible. As the night deepened, Faith began to whimper in her sleep, reaching out as if searching for something or someone. Xavier hesitated, then moved to her side, taking her hand in his. "Shh," he soothed. "You're safe now." Her eyes fluttered open, momentarily confused. "Sarah?" "No, madam. It's Xavier, the cowboy who found you." He started to pull his hand away, but she gripped it tighter. "Don't leave me," she pleaded, her voice childlike with fear. "Please, don't leave me alone." Xavier nodded solemnly. "I won't leave you, I promise." He settled beside her, keeping a respectful distance while still holding her hand. But as the night wore on and the temperature dropped, Faith shifted closer, seeking warmth and comfort. Eventually, Xavier found himself holding her against his chest, her tears dampening his shirt as he stroked her hair and murmured reassurances. "I've got you," he whispered as she finally drifted back to sleep. "I've got you." And through the long, cold night, Xavier Lancaster kept his promise, holding Faith as she grieved, watching over her as the stars wheeled overhead and the distant howls of coyotes echoed across the prairie. By morning, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't simply drop this broken woman off in the next town and ride away. Something about her had touched his soul, and for better or worse, their paths were now intertwined. When the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky with pale gold, Faith stirred in Xavier's arms. For a moment, she seemed peaceful, the lines of grief temporarily smoothed from her face. Then awareness returned, and with it, the crushing weight of her loss. Xavier felt the exact moment she remembered, her body tensing before a soft, broken sound escaped her lips. "Mourning," he said quietly, giving her space as she sat up and pulled away from him. "There's coffee if you'd like some." Faith nodded, wrapping his coat more tightly around herself. She seemed disoriented, her eyes scanning the horizon as if trying to get her bearings. "Where are we exactly?" "About 15 miles west of Fort Pierre," Xavier replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "Where were you headed before?" He let the question hang in the air. Faith took the cup, her hands still raw from digging. "I wasn't headed anywhere, not really." She took a small sip, wincing at both the heat and the bitter taste. "After Thomas died, I tried to make a go of our homestead, but it was too much. Then Sarah." Her voice caught. "Sarah got sick so fast. One day she was fine, laughing and trying to crawl, and then the fever came." Xavier nodded solemnly. "The fever takes too many out here, especially the little ones. The doctor in town said there was nothing to be done." Faith's voice had gone flat, emotionless. "I sold what was left of our things to pay for medicine that didn't work. Then I used the last of our money to bury her properly. After that," she shrugged, "I just started walking, and you ended up at that cottonwood. It seemed as good a place as any." Faith's eyes met his, challenging. I still don't understand why you stopped me. Xavier tended the fire, considering his words carefully. My ma died when I was 12. My pa couldn't handle it took to drinking, then one night just rode off and never came back, left me and my younger sister to fend for ourselves. He poked at the embers with a stick. If someone had been there for him, maybe things would have been different. Faith's expression softened slightly. What happened to your sister? She's in St. Louis now, married to a banker. A small smile touched Xavier's lips. She writes me letters, always trying to get me to settle down and stop chasing wild horses, as she puts it. Is that what you do? Chase wild horses? Xavier nodded. I break them, train them, then sell them to ranchers or the cavalry. It's a living, keeps me moving. They fell into silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the soft nickering of maple as she grazed nearby. Finally, Xavier spoke again. I need to head to Deadwood. Got a buyer, they're interested in some Mustangs I've been tracking. He hesitated. You're welcome to ride along. At least to the next town if you'd prefer. Faith stared into her coffee cup. Why would you offer that? You don't know me. I know enough, Xavier said simply. I know you're hurting worse than anyone should have to hurt. I know you've got nobody looking out for you right now. And I know that leaving you out here alone would be wrong. I'm not your responsibility. No, Xavier agreed. But sometimes folks need a helping hand even when they don't ask for it, maybe especially then. Faith was quiet for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the direction they'd come from, where her baby lay in the cold ground. Xavier could see the indecision on her face, the pull to return to that spot warring with something else, perhaps the tiniest spark of self-preservation. I don't have anything to offer in return, she finally said. No money, no skills worth mentioning. I'm not looking for payment, Miss Faith. Xavier stood, dusting off his pants. But if it makes you feel better, you can help with cooking and such while we travel. I'm terrible at making anything beyond coffee and beans. The ghost of a smile so brief he almost missed it flickered across Faith's face. I can cook, she said softly. Thomas always said my biscuits were the best in the territory. Well then, Xavier smiled, extending his hand to help her up. Seems like we might just be able to help each other after all. Faith hesitated, then placed her hand in his. As she rose to her feet, their eyes met, and Xavier saw something shift in her gaze, not happiness. Certainly not yet, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of something like hope. I'd like to say goodbye properly, she said. Before we go. Xavier nodded, understanding immediately. Of course, we'll head back to the cottonwood. They packed up camp quickly, Xavier efficient in his movements while Faith moved more slowly, her body still heavy with grief. When everything was secured, Xavier helped her onto Maple, then mounted behind her. The ride back to Sarah's grave was silent, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Faith slid from the horse before Xavier could help her down, moving with purpose toward the small mound. This time she didn't try to dig. Instead, she knelt beside the grave, her fingers gently tracing the letters of her daughter's name on the wooden cross. I'll be back, my sweet girl, she whispered. I promise I won't forget you, not ever. From his saddlebag, Xavier retrieved a small leather pouch. He dismounted and approached quietly, kneeling beside Faith. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the grave. When she nodded, he opened the pouch and pulled out a handful of wildflower seeds. My ma taught us that life always finds a way to bloom again, even in the hardest places. He scattered the seeds over the small grave. Come spring, there'll be flowers here for her. Faith's eyes welled with tears, but they were different from the desperate sobs of the previous night. Thank you, she whispered, touching his arm briefly. They remained there a few minutes longer, the morning sun warming their faces as a gentle breeze rustled through the cottonwood's leaves. Then, by unspoken agreement, they both rose and returned to Maple. As they rode away from the grave, Faith kept her eyes forward, though Xavier could feel the tension in her body. He understood every step away from that place was both a betrayal and a survival. He'd felt something similar when he'd finally left the small cabin where he and his sister had grown up, where the memory of his mother lived in every corner. "It gets easier," he said quietly, not sure if she'd want his words. Not better exactly, but easier to carry. Faith didn't respond immediately, but after a while she nodded. "I hope you're right, Mr. Lancaster. Xavier," he corrected gently, "or Zav if you prefer. Mr. Lancaster was my father and I'm not much like him." "Xavier then," Faith agreed, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic hoofbeats. They rode through the day, stopping occasionally to rest Maple and to eat some of the jerky and hardtack Xavier had in his provisions. Faith ate little, but Xavier didn't push her. Healing would come in its own time, and forcing food on her wouldn't help matters. As evening approached, they came upon a small creek lined with cottonwoods and willows, a good spot to make camp. Xavier helped Faith dismount, noting how she winced as her feet hit the ground. "You all right?" He asked, concern in his voice. Faith nodded, though her face betrayed her discomfort. "Just sore. I've been walking for days." Xavier frowned, mentally berating himself for not noticing sooner. "Let's get a fire going, then you should soak those feet in the creek. Cold water will help with the swelling." As Xavier gathered firewood and started a small fire, Faith sat on a fallen log, hesitantly removing her worn boots. Her stockings were torn, her feet blistered and bloody. Xavier sucked in a sharp breath at the sight. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, moving to kneel before her. Faith shrugged, embarrassed. "It didn't seem important." Xavier shook his head, retrieving a small kit from his saddlebag. "Out here, taking care of small problems before they become big ones is the difference between life and death." He pulled out a clean cloth and a small bottle. "This is going to sting, but it'll help prevent infection." Gently, he helped her remove her stockings, then guided her feet into the cool creek water. Faith hissed at the initial contact, but soon relaxed as the cold numbed the pain. Xavier allowed her to soak for several minutes before carefully drying her feet and applying a salve from his kit. "Where did you learn to do this?" Faith asked, watching as he worked with surprising tenderness. "When you spend as much time alone in the wilderness as I do, you learn to patch yourself up," Xavier replied, carefully wrapping clean strips of cloth around her worst blisters. "And my sister was training to be a nurse before she got married. She made sure I knew the basics." "She sounds like a good sister." Xavier smiled, finishing his work. "The best, stubborn as a mule, but the best." For the first time since they'd met, Faith's smile reached her eyes, if only for a moment. "I had a brother like that. He's in California now, trying his luck in the gold fields." "Do you write to him?" Faith's smile faded. "We lost touch after I married Thomas. He didn't approve of the match." She glanced away. "Thomas had a temper sometimes. Frederick saw it before I did." Xavier nodded, understanding the unspoken parts of her story. "Family can see things we can't sometimes. Or won't," Faith admitted quietly. As darkness fell, they shared a simple meal of beans and jerky. Xavier noticed Faith ate a little more this time, a good sign. Afterward, they sat in companionable silence, watching the fire cast dancing shadows on the trees around them. "What will you do after Deadwood?" Faith finally asked, breaking the silence. Xavier poked at the fire with a stick. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Maybe head down to Texas for the winter. Cattle drives will be finishing up, but there's usually work to be found." Faith nodded, her eyes on the flames. "And what about me? Where will I go?" "That depends on what you want," Xavier replied carefully. "Deadwood's growing fast. Might be work there for a woman who can cook. Or," he hesitated, or you could come with me," Xavier said, the words surprising even himself. "At least until you figure out what you want to do next." Faith studied him, her expression guarded. "Why would you want that?" "I'm nothing but trouble and sadness right now." "Everyone's got their burdens, Faith," Xavier said softly, "and no one should have to carry them alone." The crackling fire filled the silence between them as Faith considered his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice a near whisper. "I'll think about it." Xavier nodded, not pushing further. "Fair enough." As they prepared for sleep, Xavier set up his bedroll for Faith and made himself a makeshift bed of blankets on the other side of the fire. But as the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Faith's nightmares returned. Xavier heard her whimpering in her sleep, calling out for Sarah and Thomas. Without hesitation, he moved to her side, gently touching her shoulder. "Faith, Faith, wake up, it's just a dream." Her eyes flew open, wild with fear and grief. "Sarah, it's Xavier," he reminded her gently. "You're safe." Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed by embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," he assured her. "I was keeping watch." Faith clutched at his arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Stay, please, just until I fall asleep again." Xavier nodded, settling beside her as he had the night before. Faith turned toward him, burying her face against his chest as silent tears dampened his shirt. He held her, one hand smoothing her hair, the other holding her securely against him. "I've got you," he whispered, just as he had the night before. "I've got you." Eventually, Faith's breathing evened out as she fell back into sleep, but Xavier remained where he was, holding her through the night. As he watched the stars through the tree branches overhead, he wondered at the strange turn his life had taken. He'd set out to track wild horses, and instead found himself tracking something far more elusive, a path forward for this broken woman in his arms. And perhaps, though he hardly dared admit it even to himself, a path forward for his own lonely heart as well. The journey to Deadwood took longer than Xavier had anticipated. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they entered the Black Hills, and they had to move slowly to accommodate both Maple's endurance and Faith's still healing feet. But with each passing day, Xavier noticed subtle changes in his companion. Her appetite improved, she began to take interest in their surroundings, and occasionally she would even share stories from her life before tragedy struck. "Thomas and I met at a church social," she told him one evening as they sat beside their campfire, the remnants of a rabbit stew in their tin plates. "He was so handsome and confident, said he was going to build us the biggest farm in Dakota Territory." Xavier listened, adding another log to the fire. Had he been a farmer before? Faith shook her head, a rueful smile touching her lips. No, he was a shopkeeper's son from Pennsylvania, didn't know the first thing about farming, but he was determined to learn. "Sounds like a man with dreams," Xavier observed. "Too many dreams, maybe," Faith sighed. "He worked himself to exhaustion trying to clear more land than we needed. I begged him to start smaller, but he was always talking about the future, about leaving something grand for our children." Xavier nodded, understanding the drive that pushed men to attempt the impossible in this harsh country. "The land doesn't forgive mistakes out here." "No," Faith agreed softly. "It doesn't." As they continued their journey, Xavier found himself sharing more of his own past as well. He told Faith about growing up in Missouri, about his father's failed attempts at farming, and about his own decision to follow the Mustangs rather than put down roots. "There's a freedom in it," he explained as they rode through a narrow valley, mountains rising on either side. "Knowing I can go anywhere, follow the herds, answer to no one but myself." "Doesn't it get lonely?" Faith asked, her voice close to his ear as she sat before him on Maple. Xavier hesitated. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but loneliness is better than disappointment." Faith twisted slightly to look at him. "What do you mean?" "My pa made promises he couldn't keep. To my ma, to us kids, to himself. Every time he failed, it broke something in him. By the end, there wasn't much left to break." Xavier's voice grew quieter. "I decided a long time ago that I'd rather have no ties than broken ones." Faith considered this for a long moment. "But isn't that just another kind of failure? Being too afraid to try?" The question hit Xavier like a physical blow, all the more powerful for its gentle delivery. Before he could formulate a response, Faith continued. "I thought I'd failed at everything, being a wife, a mother, even at dying, but you showed me there might be another way forward." She placed her hand over his where it held the reins. "Maybe sometimes we need someone else to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves again." Xavier swallowed hard, oddly moved by her words. "When did you get so wise, Miss Faith?" She gave a small, sad laugh. "I'm not wise, just learning as I go, same as everyone else." They crested a hill, and suddenly, the ramshackle buildings of Deadwood came into view, nestled in the gulch below. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and even from this distance, they could hear the sounds of construction and the faint piano music drifting from a saloon. "There it is," Xavier said, pulling Maple to a halt. "Deadwood Gulch, not exactly what the preachers would call the promised land." Faith took in the scene, her expression unreadable. "It looks alive," Xavier nodded. "That it is. Gold fever makes for a lively place." They made their way down into the town, Maple picking her path carefully along the steep trail. The main street was a chaos of activity, miners trudging to and from the claims, wagons loaded with supplies, women in varying states of respectability moving between establishments, and everywhere, the mud that seemed to be Deadwood's most abundant resource. Xavier guided Maple toward a livery stable at the edge of town. "We'll get her settled first, then find somewhere for us to stay." As they dismounted, Faith looked around nervously, clearly overwhelmed by the noise and bustle after days in the quiet wilderness. Xavier placed a reassuring hand on her lower back. "Stay close," he murmured. "Deadwood's rough around the edges." The livery owner, a grizzled man named Harlan, greeted Xavier with recognition. "Lancaster didn't expect to see you till spring." "Change of plans," Xavier replied, handing over Maple's reins. "She'll need a good rub-down and extra oats. We've come a long way." Harlan nodded, his curious gaze shifting to Faith. "The wife finally caught up with you, eh?" Before Xavier could correct him, Faith stepped forward. "I'm Faith Jacobson, friend of Mr. Lancaster's." Something in her hesitation made Xavier's chest tighten strangely. Harlan just grinned, clearly drawing his own conclusions. "Well, any friend of Zav's is welcome here," he said. "You two looking for a place to stay?" Xavier nodded. "Something respectable. The lady needs proper rest." Harlan scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Widow Parker rents rooms up on William Street. Clean place, decent meals. No funny business allowed, though she might make an exception for a married couple." He winked broadly. Xavier felt heat rise to his face. "We'll check it out. Thanks, Harlan." As they walked away from the livery, Faith glanced up at Xavier. "He thinks we're together." "Sorry about that," Xavier said, adjusting his hat awkwardly. "Folks out here tend to assume things." Faith shrugged, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "It's all right. Probably safer for a woman to be thought married in a place like this anyway." Xavier hadn't considered that, but she was right. A woman alone in a mining town attracted unwanted attention. Would you be comfortable with that? "Just for appearances while we're here," Faith considered for a moment, then nodded. "It makes sense. We don't have to. I mean, it's just for show." "Of course," Xavier agreed quickly. "Just for show." They made their way to Widow Parker's boarding house, a two-story structure that stood out for its relative cleanliness compared to the surrounding buildings. The widow herself answered the door, a formidable woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "We're looking for a room," Xavier said, removing his hat politely. "Harlan at the livery recommended your establishment." Mrs. Parker assessed them critically. "I don't rent to unmarried couples or soiled doves." Before Xavier could respond, Faith stepped forward, slipping her hand into his. "We're recently married, madam. I'm Faith Lancaster, and this is my husband, Xavier." Xavier tried to hide his surprise at Faith's quick thinking and the ease with which she told the lie. Mrs. Parker's expression softened slightly. "HMPH. You look respectable enough, I suppose." "I have one room available, small but clean, $1 a night, meals included." "We'll take it," Xavier said, reaching for his money pouch. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at 5, no lunch provided, no drinking, gambling, or entertaining in the rooms." Mrs. Parker's tone made it clear these rules were non-negotiable. "And I'll need to see a marriage certificate." Faith's hand tightened around Xavier's, but her expression remained calm. "I'm afraid our papers were lost when our wagon overturned crossing the Bell Forch. We lost nearly everything." Mrs. Parker's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "We can provide references," Xavier added quickly. "I've done business with Samuel Worden at the Mercantile for years." At the mention of the merchant's name, Mrs. Parker relaxed slightly. "Sam's a good judge of character. I'll speak to him tomorrow. In the meantime, you can have the room, but no funny business under my roof. I'll know." With that warning, she led them upstairs to a small but clean room containing a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and little else. A window overlooked the busy street below. "Dinner's in an hour," Mrs. Parker informed them before closing the door firmly behind her. Alone in the room, Xavier and Faith stood awkwardly, both staring at the single bed. "I can sleep on the floor," Xavier offered immediately. Faith shook her head. "You've slept on the ground for days because of me. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering." Faith bit her lip, clearly conflicted. "We could share," she suggested hesitantly. "The bed's small, but we've slept close before." Xavier swallowed hard, remembering the nights he'd held her as she cried. This felt different somehow. "Are you sure you'd be comfortable with that?" Faith nodded, though she wouldn't meet his eyes. "It's just sleeping, and it would look strange to Mrs. Parker if the blankets weren't disturbed on both sides of the bed." "She does seem the type to check," Xavier agreed, trying to keep his tone light despite the sudden quickening of his pulse. They settled into an uneasy silence as they washed the trail dust from their faces and hands. Xavier found himself stealing glances at Faith when she wasn't looking. The town's grime couldn't hide the delicate beauty of her features or the graceful way she moved. In just these few days, she seemed to be coming back to life, like a wilted flower gradually straightening after a long drought. Dinner was a simple but hearty affair: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie served at a long table in the dining room where they joined the boarding house's other residents. There was a pair of serious-looking men who introduced themselves as assayers from the mining company, an elderly schoolteacher named Miss Abernathy, and a young widow, Mrs. Collins, with her quiet 10-year-old son. Throughout the meal, Faith maintained their charade with surprising ease, occasionally touching Xavier's arm or smiling at him in a way that suggested intimacy. Xavier found himself responding naturally, pulling out her chair, ensuring she had enough bread, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder as he asked if she wanted more stew. It felt both strange and oddly right, this pretense of being a married couple. After dinner, they retired to their room, the awkwardness returning as they faced the reality of sharing the small space for the night. Xavier busied himself checking that the window was secure while Faith sat on the edge of the bed, removing the pins from her hair. Xavier caught himself staring as the auburn waves fell past her shoulders. "I should step out while you prepare for bed," he said, turning away abruptly. Faith's voice stopped him. "Xavier," he turned back, finding her watching him with an unreadable expression. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything. For saving me that night, for bringing me here, for making me feel safe again." Xavier felt something shift between them in that moment, a subtle change in the air, in the way she looked at him, in the sudden tightness in his chest. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "Anyone would have done the same." Faith shook her head slowly. "No, they wouldn't have. Most would have ridden past or left me at the first town." She rose and crossed to him, placing a hand lightly on his chest. "You're a good man, Xavier Lancaster." Before he could respond, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then quickly turned away. "You can step out now. I won't be long." Xavier found himself in the hallway without clear memory of leaving the room, his cheek burning where her lips had touched it. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing and quiet the sudden tumult of his thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. Faith was vulnerable, grieving. He had offered help, not whatever this was becoming. And yet, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just sympathy or protectiveness anymore. It was something deeper, something that both exhilarated and terrified him. When Faith called him back into the room, she was already in bed, the covers pulled up to her chin, her hair spread across the pillow. Xavier changed quickly in the darkest corner of the room, then hesitantly approached the bed. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one last time. Faith nodded, moving to make space for him. I'm sure. Xavier eased himself onto the mattress, keeping as close to the edge as possible without falling off. They lay side by side, not touching, both staring at the ceiling as the sounds of deadwood piano music, distant laughter, the occasional shout filtered through the window. "Good night, Xavier," Faith whispered after a long silence. "Good night, Faith," he replied, wondering if she could hear the rapid beating of his heart in the quiet room. Sleep seemed impossible with her so close, yet exhaustion eventually claimed him. Sometime in the night, he half woke to find Faith nestled against him, her head on his shoulder, her arm across his chest. Still more asleep than awake, he wrapped his arm around her, drawing her closer, and together they drifted back into dreams, two lonely souls finding comfort in each other's warmth. Morning came with the clanging of Mrs. Parker's breakfast bell and the realization that they were tangled together in the small bed, Faith's face tucked against Xavier's neck, his arms wrapped protectively around her. They separated hastily, both mumbling apologies as they scrambled to prepare for the day. "I need to meet with my buyer today," Xavier said as they made their way downstairs for breakfast. "The sooner I finalize this deal, the sooner we can decide our next move." Faith nodded, adjusting the borrowed shawl Mrs. Collins had lent her the night before. "I'd like to look for some work while we're here. Mrs. Parker mentioned the hotel might need help in the kitchen." Xavier frowned slightly. "You don't need to worry about that. I have money enough for both of us." "I know," Faith said gently, "but I need to feel useful again, to have purpose." Looking at her determined expression, Xavier understood. "All right, just be careful. Deadwood's no place for a lady to wander alone." Faith's lips curved into a small smile. "I may be a lady, Xavier, but I'm not as fragile as you think." After breakfast, they parted ways, Xavier to meet his Mustang buyer, and Faith to inquire about work at the Grand Central Hotel. They agreed to meet back at the boarding house for dinner. Xavier's meeting went better than expected. The buyer, a wealthy rancher named Holbrook, was eager to purchase several well-trained horses for his expanding operation. "I need at least 10 head, Holbrook explained as they shared whiskey in a relatively quiet corner of the Gem Saloon. "Good stock, mind you. No wild-eyed beasts that'll throw my men first chance they get." Xavier nodded, mentally calculating. "I've spotted a promising herd about 3 days' ride from here. If the weather holds, I could have them rounded up and started on basic training within 3 weeks. "That's longer than I'd hoped," Holbrook frowned. "Quality takes time," Xavier replied evenly, "but I can guarantee you'll get horses worth every cent." They haggled over price and timing, eventually reaching an agreement that satisfied both parties. Holbrook would pay half up front for expenses, with the balance due upon delivery of the horses to his ranch near Cheyenne. "You've got yourself a deal, Lancaster," Holbrook said, extending his hand. "Though I'm surprised you're taking on such a big job alone." "Most horse breakers work with at least one partner." Xavier hesitated, an idea forming. "Actually, I won't be alone this time. My wife will be assisting me." Holbrook raised his eyebrows. "Wife, since when did you get hitched?" "Recently," Xavier replied, the lie coming easier than he expected. "She's handy with horses." It wasn't until he was walking back to the boarding house that Xavier fully realized the implications of what he'd said. The plan had been to see Faith safely to Deadwood, help her find work if she wanted it, then continue on his way as he always had. But the thought of leaving her behind now made his chest tighten uncomfortably. When he arrived at the boarding house, he found Faith already returned, sitting in the small parlor with Mrs. Collins and her son. She was showing the boy how to play cat's cradle with a length of string, her face animated in a way he hadn't seen before. She looked up when he entered, and the smile she gave him caused a warmth to spread through his chest. "Xavier, how was your meeting?" she asked, excusing herself from the game. "Successful," he replied, unable to keep from smiling back. "Very successful. How about you? Any luck at the hotel?" Faith nodded, her eyes bright with excitement. "They've hired me to help in the kitchen for the next few weeks." The cook is short-handed with the influx of miners. Xavier led her to a quiet corner of the parlor, lowering his voice. That's wonderful, but I may have complicated things. He explained about the deal with Holbrook and his impulsive claim about having a wife to help with the horses. To his surprise, Faith didn't seem upset. It makes sense, doesn't it? We're already pretending to be married here, and I did grow up around horses. My father raised them in Minnesota before we moved west. Xavier blinked in surprise. You never mentioned that, Faith shrugged. You never asked. I'm not an expert like you, but I know which end kicks and which end eats. A laugh escaped Xavier, louder than he intended, drawing curious glances from Mrs. Collins and her son. Faith Jacobson, you are full of surprises. Faith Lancaster, according to our current arrangement, she corrected with a small smile. Xavier sobered, studying her face. Are you sure about this? Coming with me to round up mustangs isn't exactly a safe occupation, and we'd be alone in the wilderness for weeks. I trust you, Faith said simply. And truthfully, I'm not ready to be alone yet. The nightmares still come, but they're less terrible when you're near. The honesty in her admission touched something deep inside Xavier. Then it settled. We'll leave in 2 days, after you've had a chance to work a bit at the hotel, and we've gathered the supplies we'll need. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparations. Faith worked her shifts at the hotel kitchen, earning enough to purchase a few necessities: a sturdy pair of boots, a warm coat, and other clothing more suitable for trail life than her tattered dress. Xavier visited Samuel Worden's mercantile, stocking up on provisions for their journey. Their pretense of marriage continued at the boarding house, becoming more natural with each passing day. Xavier found himself reaching for Faith's hand without thinking, his arm settling around her shoulders as they sat in the parlor after dinner. Faith, too, seemed to grow more comfortable with the charade, learning to anticipate his movements, leaning into his touch in a way that made his heart race. At night, they continued to share the narrow bed, though always with careful space between them when they first lay down. Inevitably, they would wake entwined, Faith's head on Xavier's chest, his arms around her. Neither mentioned these morning discoveries, though Xavier caught Faith watching him with a thoughtful expression when she thought he wasn't looking. On the morning of their departure, Mrs. Parker surprised them with a packed lunch for the trail. Can't have you starving before you even get started, she said gruffly, pressing the bundle into Faith's hands. And you, she added, fixing Xavier with a stern look, take good care of your wife out there. Wild country's no place for a woman alone. Yes, madam, Xavier agreed, touched by the older woman's concern. I'll guard her with my life. Mrs. Parker snorted. See that you do, and come back for a proper bed when you're done with your horse business. My door's always open to decent folks. They left Deadwood as the sun crested the eastern hills, Maple carrying their supplies while Xavier and Faith walked beside her. The dirt streets were already bustling with morning activity, miners heading to their claims, storekeepers opening their establishments, and the saloon girls finally heading to their beds after a long night's work. As they passed the last buildings and the wilderness opened before them, Xavier glanced at Faith, wondering if she felt the same mixture of anticipation and uncertainty that churned in his stomach. Their arrangement had begun as a simple rescue, a cowboy saving a grieving woman from herself, but it had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What exactly it was becoming, Xavier couldn't say, but he knew it was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Are you ready for this? He asked as they turned onto the trail that would lead them to the Mustang herd. Faith took a deep breath, looking at the expansive landscape before them, then back at Xavier. The morning sun caught in her auburn hair, turning it to fire, and for a moment she looked almost ethereal. Yes, she said with quiet confidence. I'm ready. The 3 days' journey to the area where Xavier had spotted the Mustang herd was challenging but uneventful. They established a comfortable routine, Xavier handling the hunting and fire building, Faith preparing the meals and helping set up their simple camp. At night, They continued to sleep close together, both for warmth and because, though neither admitted it aloud, they had grown accustomed to the comfort of each other's presence. On the fourth morning, they crested a hill and Xavier pointed to a grassy valley below, where a dozen or more wild horses grazed in the early light. "There they are," he said softly. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Faith nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. The mustangs were indeed magnificent, lean, muscular animals with flowing manes and tails, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. "How do we catch them?" Xavier grinned. "Carefully, very carefully." Over the next days, Xavier taught Faith the art of mustang capture. They built a simple corral using fallen trees and rope, positioned strategically at the narrow end of the valley. Then began the slow, patient work of gradually herding the wild horses toward the trap without spooking them into flight. "It's all about pressure and release," Xavier explained as they worked to gently push the herd in the desired direction. "Too much pressure, they run. Too little, they ignore you. The trick is finding the perfect balance." Faith proved to be a quick study, her natural affinity for horses making her an able assistant. Xavier found himself watching her with growing admiration as she moved quietly and confidently among the animals, her fear and grief seemingly forgotten in the focus of their work. 2 weeks into their endeavor, they had successfully corralled 8 mustangs, 4 mares, and 4 geldings, and Xavier had begun the painstaking process of gentling them to human touch. Each day brought small victories as the wild horses gradually accepted halters, then lead ropes, then finally the weight of a saddle blanket on their backs. Faith's presence made the work not only easier but more enjoyable than Xavier had ever found it before. In the evenings, they would sit by their campfire, discussing the day's progress, planning the next day's tasks, and increasingly sharing stories from their pasts. The comfortable silence that had once existed between them had transformed into an easy conversation that could last for hours. "My father would have loved this," Faith remarked one evening as they watched the stars appear overhead. "He always said there was nothing more honest than a wild horse. No pretense, no lies, just pure instinct and feeling." Xavier nodded, stoking the fire. "Smart man." Horses don't care about your past or your failures, they only care about how you treat them in the present. Faith's eyes reflected the dancing flames as she looked at him. "Is that why you prefer them to people? Because they don't judge?" Xavier considered the question. "Partly. And partly because they don't make demands I can't fulfill." "What kind of demands?" "Staying in one place, building something permanent." Xavier shrugged. "The kinds of things most women expect from a man." Faith was quiet for a long moment. "Not all women want the same things, Xavier. Some of us have learned that permanence is an illusion anyway." There was a depth of understanding in her words that made Xavier study her face more carefully. "What do you want, Faith, now that you're healing?" She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "I'm not sure yet. For so long, all I wanted was what Thomas wanted: the farm, the family, the future he had planned. When he died, those dreams died too. Then when Sarah..." Her voice caught briefly. "When Sarah died, I stopped wanting anything at all." And now, Faith's eyes met his, surprisingly clear and direct. "Now I think I want to feel alive again, to find out who I am without them, who Faith is on her own terms." Something in her words stirred a response deep within Xavier. He understood that search for self, that need to define one's own path. It was what had led him to the solitary life he'd lived for so many years. "Well," he said softly, "you seem to be doing a fine job of it so far. You're stronger than you know, Faith Jacobson." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed her face. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I just have good company these days." Xavier felt his cheeks warm, and it had nothing to do with the fire. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how easy it would be to reach out and take her hand, to pull her closer still. Before he could act on the impulse, a distant howl broke the moment. Wolves, somewhere in the hills to the north. Both Xavier and Faith looked in that direction, the spell between them temporarily broken. "We should check on the horses," Xavier said, rising to his feet and offering Faith his hand. Wolves make them nervous. She took his hand, allowing him to pull her up, and for a moment they stood close enough that Xavier could feel the warmth of her breath on his face. Then she stepped back, nodding toward the corral. Lead the way, Cowboy. The days blended into weeks as they continued their work with the Mustangs. Xavier marveled at Faith's transformation. The hollow-eyed woman he'd pulled from her baby's grave was now replaced by someone who laughed, who sang softly to the horses as she brushed them, who challenged him with her quick wit and thoughtful questions. Her grief hadn't disappeared. He still heard her crying sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, but it no longer defined her completely. And with each passing day, Xavier found it harder to imagine returning to his solitary existence once their work was complete. He'd grown accustomed to Faith's presence, to her gentle voice, to the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. He'd grown accustomed to her, and it terrified him. One afternoon, as they worked side by side gentling a particularly spirited mare, the horse suddenly reared, striking out with her front hooves. Xavier reacted instinctively, shoving Faith out of harm's way. The mare's hoof caught him on the temple, sending him sprawling in the dirt. Xavier. Faith's alarmed cry seemed to come from far away as darkness encroached on the edges of his vision. He tried to sit up, but the world spun violently and he collapsed back onto the ground. Cool hands touched his face and Faith's worried eyes appeared above him. Don't move, you're bleeding. Xavier tried to focus on her face, but it wavered like a reflection in disturbed water. The mare, she's fine, settled down as soon as you fell. Faith was tearing a strip from her petticoat, her movements quick and efficient. I need to bandage your head, that's a nasty cut. Xavier submitted to her ministrations, wincing as she cleaned the wound with water from their canteen, then bound it with the cloth. Her touch was gentle but confident, and despite the pain, he found himself strangely content to be cared for by her. You saved me, Faith said quietly as she finished securing the bandage. Again. Xavier attempted a smile, though he suspected it came out as more of a grimace. Becoming a habit, isn't it? Faith's expression grew serious. Why do you keep doing that, risking yourself for me? The question caught Xavier off guard, especially in his dazed state. The truth slipped out before he could stop it. Because I care about you, more than I should. Faith's hands stilled on his face, her eyes widening slightly. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved or spoke. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his in a gentle, questioning kiss. Xavier froze, certain he must be hallucinating from the blow to his head. But Faith's lips were warm and real against his, her hand still cradling his face as if he were something precious. When she began to pull away, uncertainty in her eyes, Xavier reached up to thread his fingers through her hair, drawing her back down to him. This time, the kiss deepened, expressing all the feelings that had been building between them over these weeks together: tenderness, desire, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. When they finally parted, both were breathless. I shouldn't have done that, Faith whispered, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. Why not? Xavier asked, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. Because I'm still broken inside, because you deserve someone whole. Xavier shook his head carefully, mindful of his injury. Everyone's broken in some way, Faith. That doesn't mean we can't find happiness in the pieces that fit together. Tears welled in Faith's eyes, but they weren't tears of grief this time. When did you become so wise, Xavier Lancaster? He smiled, his head throbbing but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Must be the company I've been keeping lately. Faith helped him to his feet and supported him as they made their way back to camp. That night, as they lay together beneath the stars, their newfound closeness manifested in gentle touches and whispered conversations that continued until dawn painted the eastern sky with gold. The remaining days of their Mustang training passed in a haze of work and discovery of the horses' unique personalities and quirks, but more importantly, discovery of each other. Every shared glance, Every casual touch, every kiss stolen in moments of privacy, wove another strand in the bond forming between them. By the time the Mustangs were gentle enough to lead on a string, following Maple like obedient children, Xavier and Faith had established a relationship neither had anticipated but both had come to treasure. They hadn't spoken of what would happen after delivering the horses to Holbrook, but the question hung between them, growing more urgent as the day approached. They were a day's ride from Holbrook's ranch when a spring thunderstorm caught them on the open plain. The sky darkened ominously, and within minutes, rain was falling in sheets while lightning split the sky. "We need shelter," Xavier shouted over the howling wind. "There's a line shack about a mile east used by the cattle drovers in summer." Faith nodded, pulling her coat tighter as they urged the horses forward through the deluge. The Mustangs, already nervous from the storm, became increasingly difficult to control. One particularly loud thunderclap sent them into a panic, several breaking free from their lead ropes and bolting across the prairie. "No," Xavier cried, watching as half their herd disappeared into the curtain of rain. Faith grabbed his arm. "Let them go, we need to get the others to safety first." She was right, of course. They managed to keep the remaining horses together, leading them to the relative safety of the line shack, a small, crude structure with a leaking roof and dirt floor, but solid enough to provide shelter from the worst of the storm. Once the horses were secured in the adjoining lean-to, Xavier and Faith stumbled into the shack, both soaked to the skin and shivering from the unexpected cold front that had accompanied the storm. "We need to get out of these wet clothes," Xavier said, immediately setting about starting a fire in the small stove that occupied one corner of the shack. Faith nodded, her teeth chattering too hard for speech. She turned her back, fumbling with the buttons of her sodden dress while Xavier coaxed the fire to life. Soon, the small space was filled with warmth and the hissing of steam as they hung their clothes to dry. Wrapped in the single blanket they'd managed to keep dry in Xavier's oilskin pack, they huddled together before the stove, listening to the storm rage outside. "What about the horses that ran off?" Faith asked, her head resting on Xavier's shoulder. Xavier sighed. "We'll look for them at first light, but honestly, they could be miles from here by now." "Will Holbrook still want the ones we have left? 5 horses instead of 10, he won't be happy." Xavier ran a hand through his damp hair. "But they're good animals, well trained. He'll take them, even if at a reduced price." Faith was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "And after that, what happens after we deliver the horses?" Xavier looked down at her, studying the face that had become so dear to him. "That depends on what you want, Faith." She met his gaze steadily. "I want to stay with you if you'll have me." The simple honesty of her words made Xavier's heart swell. "There's nothing I want more, but my life, it's not an easy one, always moving, never settling." "Are you sure that's what you want?" Faith shifted to face him fully. "When I met you, I thought my life was over. I was ready to bury myself beside my baby and give up on everything." Her voice trembled slightly at the memory. "But you didn't just save my life that night, Xavier. You showed me it was still worth living." Xavier touched her cheek gently. "You saved me too, you know, from a life of loneliness I didn't even realize I was trapped in." Faith leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "So perhaps we're even." "Not quite," Xavier murmured, drawing her closer, "but we have a lifetime to work it out." As the storm raged outside, they found sanctuary in each other's arms, their kisses growing more urgent, their touches more intimate. When Faith whispered, "I'm not broken anymore," Xavier understood she was offering him not just her body but her heart, finally healed enough to love again. That night, on the hard floor of a lined shack in the middle of nowhere, they discovered a deeper connection than either had known before, not just physical passion, though there was plenty of that, but the profound intimacy of two souls recognizing each other as home. Morning brought clear skies and the realization that their lives had changed irrevocably. As they dressed and prepared to search for the lost horses, Xavier caught Faith's hand, pulling her to him for a gentle kiss. "Marry me," he said, the words surprising even himself with their certainty. "For real this time, not just pretend for boarding houses and business deals." Faith's eyes widened. "Xavier, I know it's sudden," he continued quickly. "And if you need time," Faith pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping his words. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Xavier's face split into a grin wider than any Faith had seen before. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around in the small confines of the shack until they were both laughing breathlessly. They managed to recover 3 of the 5 missing horses, leaving them with 8 to deliver to Holbrook. As Xavier had predicted, the rancher wasn't pleased with the reduced number but agreed to take what they had at a fair price. "Weather's a risk we all face out here," he conceded gruffly. "And these are fine animals, I'll give you that. Well worth the price." With their business concluded and payment in hand, Xavier and Faith faced the wide open future before them. They were married a week later in Cheyenne by a traveling preacher, with only Maple and the remaining Mustang Xavier had kept for Faith as witnesses. "Where to now, Mrs. Lancaster?" Xavier asked as they mounted their horses after the simple ceremony. Faith smiled, the sunlight catching the golden flecks in her eyes. "Everywhere," she answered. "Anywhere, as long as we're together." Xavier reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. "Together," he agreed, "always." As they rode toward the setting sun, Faith thought of the small grave beneath the cottonwood tree on the Dakota plains. She would always carry Sarah in her heart, just as she would always remember Thomas and the life they had tried to build. But now she carried something else too, a future bright with possibility, and a love strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds. Xavier watched his wife's profile against the golden sky, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had found her trying to bury herself beside her baby, had pulled her away and held her through that long, dark night, never imagining that in saving her, he would ultimately save himself as well. The following spring found them in Montana Territory, where the valleys were lush with new grass and the mountains still wore caps of snow. They had established a small but growing business breaking and training horses for ranches and the Army, their reputation for quality work spreading throughout the region. They had built a modest cabin on a piece of land near a clear running stream, with corrals for the horses and even a small garden where Faith grew vegetables and herbs. It wasn't the permanent home most would envision. They still followed the herds for months at a time, living in a canvas tent or under the stars, but it was their place to return to, their anchor in a life of movement. On a warm May morning, almost exactly a year after they had met, Faith stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching Xavier work with a spirited young colt in the corral. Her hand rested unconsciously on her slightly rounded belly where their child, a son, she felt certain had been growing for 4 months now. She hadn't told Xavier yet, wanting to be absolutely sure before sharing news that would bring both joy and, inevitably, memories of loss. But as he looked up and caught her watching him, his face breaking into the smile that still made her heart skip, Faith knew it was time. Xavier saw something in her expression that made him pause his work. He secured the colt to the fence post and crossed to where she stood, concern in his eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. Faith took his hand and placed it on her belly, watching as understanding dawned in his eyes. "Everything's perfect," she whispered. "We're going to have a baby." Xavier's expression transformed from shock to wonder to pure joy in the span of heartbeats. He knelt before her, pressing his ear to her abdomen as if he might hear the child within. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Faith ran her fingers through his hair, tears of happiness threatening to spill. "Are you happy?" Xavier looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Happier than I ever thought possible." He rose to his feet, gathering her in his arms. Are you afraid, after Sarah?" Faith nodded, not hiding the truth from him. A little, but mostly I'm hopeful. We've come so far, Xavier. We've both learned that life continues even after the worst happens. Xavier kissed her tenderly. Our child will know about their sister, about how brave and strong their mother is. About how love can find us even in our darkest moments. That night, as they lay together in their bed, Xavier's hand protective over Faith's growing belly, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the depths of despair at her baby's grave to this moment of profound happiness, it seemed almost miraculous. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "When you found me," Xavier's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes. I thank God every day that I happened to be tracking those Mustangs in that particular direction." Faith turned in his embrace to face him. "It wasn't chance, Xavier, it was fate," he smiled, touching her face gently. "Maybe so. All I know is that when I pulled you away from that grave and held you through the night, I never imagined I was holding my future in my arms." Faith kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. "You saved more than just my life that night. You saved my capacity to love again. To hope again. And you gave me a home," Xavier murmured against her lips. "Not just a place, but here." He placed his hand over his heart. "For the first time in my life, I'm not running anymore." As they drifted toward sleep, Faith's thoughts turned to their child growing within her. This baby would be born into love, into a family forged through grief and healing, loss and discovery. A family that understood the preciousness of each moment because they had learned, in the hardest possible way, how quickly everything could change. Their life might not be conventional. They would still follow the Mustang herds, still camp beneath the stars for weeks at a time, but it would be rich with purpose and meaning. And their child would grow up knowing both the freedom of the open prairie and the security of being deeply, completely loved. In the quiet darkness of their cabin, with the sound of their horses nickering softly in the corral outside and the promise of new life nestled between them, Faith and Xavier had found what so many spend a lifetime searching for. Not just love, but a sense of belonging, of coming home at last. And as Faith felt Xavier's breathing deepen into sleep beside her, his arm still protectively cradling her and their unborn child, she offered a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the cowboy, who had refused to let her bury herself in her grief, the man who had held her through that long, dark night and every night since, the man who had shown her that even from the ashes of unimaginable loss, new life and love could bloom again.